Are you a citizen or current resident in the United States? If so, how would you answer this question? Are you loyal to the United States? For some of you, the answer may be a resounding yes. You're loyal to the US because you believe in its democratic ideals, because the US is where you call home. For others, the answer may be a definite no. You don't consider yourself loyal to the US because you don't support the current administration, or perhaps home is elsewhere, outside of the US. For the rest of us, the answer may be a mix of yes and no. Perhaps you consider the US your home, but you don't support the current administration. Perhaps you believe in the US's democratic ideals, but you resent its colonial past. Perhaps you take issue with the wording of the question. What does it mean to be loyal to a government? How does one show their loyalty to a country? And can you be loyal and critical at the same time? Are you loyal to the United States? This painful, difficult, and existential question was what Japanese American incarcerees were faced with while they were imprisoned during World War II. Many of us may have learned that following the Pearl Harbor attacks on December 7th of 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued an executive order that set into motion the forced removal and incarceration of over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry into so-called internment camps. But many of us, in fact, actually few of us, may be aware that a year after the executive order was issued, the War Department decided to recruit young Japanese Americans from the camps into the military, yes, to fight the Japanese. And they distributed a questionnaire to help them determine which incarcerees were loyal to the US government and therefore eligible for military recruitment. This questionnaire later became known as the Loyalty Questionnaire because it included two controversial questions that helped the War Department identify which incarcerees were loyal or disloyal to the US government. The questions were, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? And will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces? And here's the important part. Forswear any allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization. These questions, especially the last question, caused a lot of confusion amongst the camp population. For example, if you were a US-born citizen, which mind you, 2/3 of the camp population was at this time, forswearing allegiance to the Japanese emperor would connote that you had an allegiance to the Japanese emperor to begin with. So some feared that answering yes to this question could criminalize them as potential saboteurs. On the other hand, if you were not born in the US, forswearing allegiance to the Japanese emperor could mean giving up your statehood, since foreign-born aliens were unable to naturalize into American citizens yet at this time. So some feared that answering yes to this question could render them stateless refugees. For many incarcerees, these questions, they frankly felt like a slap in the face, delivered to them a year after they had been displaced from their homes and held captive in these remote camps across the US. Some incarcerees, they answered no to these questions strictly on moral grounds, to protest the stark violation of their constitutional rights. Unfortunately, those who answered no or refused to answer these two questions were deemed disloyal. They were dubbed no-nos and sent to a maximum security camp called Tule Lake in Northern California, often separated from their friends and family. In total, there were about 12,000 no-nos who were sent to Tule Lake. Many were stigmatized by the general public and even members of their own community for being traitors to the U.S. I am a first-generation immigrant from Japan who came to the U.S. as a toddler. I have no family ties to the camps. Until recently, my knowledge of the camps was limited to what I'd read in history textbooks, that Japanese Americans were displaced from their homes and incarcerated in camps during the war. I learned that despite this grave injustice, Japanese Americans had responded with silent vigilance. I learned that instead of protesting the indignities of camp life, they had built gardens, they had formed baseball teams, and they had continued their education in shoddy barrack classrooms. I learned that rather than talking about their incarceration, Japanese Americans, they remained silent about the incarceration to forget and move on past the stark chapter in their family histories. But after learning about the loyalty questionnaire, I began to wonder if the history textbooks captured the entire story. I began asking Japanese Americans for their accounts of what happened during the war. And you know what they taught me? They taught me that the camp population was far from silent. In fact, there were fervent no-no dissenters, as much as there were brazen servicemen who fought and died for the U.S. They taught me that incarcerees, they formed baseball teams and beautified their surroundings, not from a place of compliance, but to protect their children from the shame and humiliation of growing up in a desolate camp. They taught me that far from wanting to forget about their family histories, hundreds of Japanese American families have been revisiting their camps in the form of pilgrimages since the late 1960s in order to remember and honor their ancestors. Growing up, the story of Japanese American incarceration was presented to me as a historical event that forced my community into silence. But I soon learned that the story of Japanese American incarceration is not a story of Japanese American victimhood, but a quintessentially American story of survival and belonging, and the silent choices we make to forge a life here in this country, to call this country home. This was the impetus for my project, Kyampu, an American Story, which is an educational website that features portraits of survivors and descendants of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. Over the past 2 years, and with the support of National Geographic Society, I have been joining these families as they embark on pilgrimages and asking them to reflect on their family histories. Here's a trailer featuring Gregory and Midori Sampson, whom I had the privilege of joining on a pilgrimage back to Tule Lake, where Gregory's mother was incarcerated.
I was raised that this is a period of my family's life that we want to forget. Our family is like we never really talked about a lot of stuff, personal stuff. I never knew my parents' birthday, or I never knew anything about their history. I didn't even know how I fit in the family dynamic. All of my siblings all have this tendency to have secrets. And I think that's a lot of what my mom learned, to repress a lot of ideas or attitudes because it's going to get you in trouble. When we named our daughter Midori, my mom had a fit. Just went on for a couple months about how this was going to be nothing but trouble for us with her name being Japanese, and why would you do that to her? And so, yeah, there's that feeling in there of that this could happen again.
As Gregory shared, many Japanese American families did not talk about their incarceration after the war. And while this silence is often interpreted as avoidance or emotional incompetence, or perhaps a cultural tendency not to disclose your inner struggles, Gregory shared with me that his mother likely did not talk about her incarceration in order to protect her children and grandchildren from the shame and discrimination that she had experienced. So instead of asking families to divulge these unspoken narratives and to break this gentle and protective silence, I have been asking survivors and descendants to handwrite a letter. For survivors, a letter to their child self when they were incarcerated, and for descendants, a letter to the survivor and their family. The family you're seeing here is the Ideno family, whom I had the privilege of joining on a pilgrimage back to Rower, a camp in southeastern Arkansas. Sitting here in the middle is survivor Kazuo Ideno, with his daughter Karen on the right and his grandchildren, Jacqueline and Blake, on the left. Survivor Kazuo Ideno, he dedicated his letter to his 2.5-year-old self when he and his family were displaced from their home in San Francisco and first arrived in Rower.
Dear young Kaz, you are not responsible for Japan starting World War II against the United States. Unfortunately, because you were only 2.5 years old when you were incarcerated, you developed a sense of guilt and shame during your formative years after leaving camp. You spent many years trying to prove you were a patriotic American, such as refusing to take Japanese language classes and legally adding an American first name when you turned 15. It took years for you to realize your Japanese American culture has always been an important part of who you are. The influence of your parents still carries on in you, as well as the responsibility to pass on Japanese American culture to your children and grandchildren. Love, Kaz.
And this is his daughter Karen, who dedicated her letter to her father.
Dad, I can see the scars on your skin of the burns from the potbelly stove, a result of being a toddler in cramped quarters. The deeper scars of inferiority and shame are hidden inside your heart and mind. Shadows of those scars have been passed through the generations as we continue to endure prejudice and racism. How devastating it must have been for your family to lose everything: the home, the business, your freedom. How tremendously stressful it must have been for Grandma to face incarceration alone as a single mom, since the FBI had taken Grandpa to prison immediately for being a community leader. How embarrassed Grandma must have been every day to use the open communal bathrooms and showers that had been deliberately designed to humiliate. How terrified you must have been when you learn that your dad had almost died after being stabbed in the back by a drunk guard. My heart cries when I think about this painful chapter you survived. You and Grandma were born here. 2 generations of Americans, yet somehow not considered American enough due to racial prejudice. It is our duty to make sure the legacy lives on through the generations, and this travesty never happens again. Love, Karen.
These portraits are compiled into family profiles where readers can learn about one family's history from multi-generational perspectives. These family profiles include the photos and the audio that we have just experienced together, as well as some contextual information about each individual and how they've interpreted their family histories. So far, I have had the privilege of photographing over 60 individuals across 30 families. These portraits are showcased on the Kiampu website, which is meant to serve as an educational resource for secondary school teachers to use when they're teaching this segment of U.S. history. The Kiampu website is currently in progress, but set to launch next year on Day of Remembrance. That's February 19th of 2025, in time for the 80th year anniversary of the end of World War II. Now, traditional storytelling can be extractional at times, the success of which is often measured by the amount of information that we can draw from an individual. But as these Japanese American families have taught me, sometimes the true story lies in the gardens that we diligently build, the decisions that we quietly make, and the silence between generations. I stand on the backs of many prolific journalists and storytellers, many of whom I share the room with here today, that have challenged the ethics of traditional storytelling, who have paved the way for less traditional projects like Kiampu to reach a broad audience. As a storyteller, I hope to continue this legacy, to honor not only the stories that are being told, but also, if not especially, the stories that are held a little closer to the heart, the stories that lie beneath this gentle and protective silence. Thank you.
Silk Road Ensemble for just that amazing, stirring performance. You know, I felt like you opened up this contemplative space for us all after Haruka's very powerful presentation, and then we were brought along on this journey of incredible discovery, and I really appreciate that. I really, really enjoyed that immensely. I'm going to pull up my notes. My name is Joy Lin. I'm the Vice President of Journalism at the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and I'm also a member of the Board of Directors of Media Impact Funders. And thank you for sticking around until the end. I know it's been a very long day. There's just been so much, and I'd love to talk more about it with you afterwards. But you know, I understand from the conference producers that this session was strategically placed at this time because it not only embodies the theme of the forum, but also aims to leave you feeling hopeful. I definitely went through an emotional roller coaster myself today. This discussion is designed to speak to our current societal moment where the things that divide us can often make us lose sight of the things we share in common. And exploring whether shared values can bring us together is essential. And so we're honored to have Nicholas Ma with us, a renowned writer, director, and producer. Nicholas will share insights about his upcoming documentary, Leap of Faith. This film follows 12 Christian pastors from diverse backgrounds as they navigate personal and societal challenges in seeking to forge common ground. Joining Nicholas in this conversation is Kristen Campbell, the executive director of PACE. Together, they will discuss the purpose behind Leap of Faith and how it explores the potential for unity in the face of polarization. Earlier, I just attended the session on Israel-Palestinian dialogue, where dialogue was described as this like a secure place for argument. And the words are a reminder that it's easy to talk about the need to pursue common ground, but we cannot presume that achieving it is an inevitability. And I look forward to hearing more about this film. There's so much to learn from the experiences of these pastors and the process of documenting their journey. So please join me in welcoming Nicholas Ma and Kristen Campbell.
Thank you so much, Joy, and thank you to the entire Media Impact Funders team for this amazing event. And thank you for Nicholas for being in conversation with me this afternoon. Nicholas, you have a new film coming out called Leap of Faith. Folks in this room may or may not be aware that they have probably seen one of your films before. It's called Won't You Be My Neighbor? And it was the Fred Rogers documentary. Yeah, so this new project, PACE has been proud to be a supporter, a very modest financial supporter, a very major reputational capital supporter of this film, given our faith and democracy initiative. So, Nicholas, why did you make this film? And specifically, why did you make a film about faith?
You know, it's interesting because I don't even know if I have a really good answer to that question. And maybe I will by September. I think part of it is this making a film is an act of faith, right? You spend years toiling away over a film and you have no idea what's going to happen when you release it into the world. But you believe that there is something within it, some germ that matters, that you can see and that you hope at least someone else will see as well, that there'll be some communication. And it's not just that temporal question, it's I have an idea in my head that I can't force you to feel. I can just ask you to be present for it. And film is a medium where that kind of synchronicity is possible. And I think also we talk about faith in a way that's so narrow, right? We talk about people of faith, people of reason, and I think that does a pretty wild injustice to both sides of that ledger. People of faith tend to work with a lot of reason. And people of reason, I think, tend to exercise a lot of faith, right? We talk about faith with a capital F, which we can think of as being creedal or being, Christian or Hindu, or we can think of faith as being related to religion institutionally. But faith is what we choose to believe in our world. And that can be as simple as having faith in the person next to us, in our families, and it can be as complicated as Haruka reminded us as having faith in our country and its institutions and norms. And so I think to make a film about faith right now and to center it within Christianity, which even though we hear all these words about how it's declining, still remains the vast, the largest plurality of people in this country, seemed appropriate. And to ask ourselves whether those ideas, which are bigger than us, whether we can accept difference that lies beneath those big ideas. Is there a hierarchy of ideas where those big ones allow us to tolerate difference that can at times feel insurmountable?
The tagline for this event is Media Philanthropy to Bridge a Divided World. And as my colleague Amy, who is here, would say, each one of those words is its own universe to explore. And so I want to break down the various components of that tagline by asking you how you understand them and what you learned about them through the course of making this film. So first, I want to dig into the word bridge. And at PACE, we often hear people say, well, of course I want to build a bridge because then it will be easier for you to get to where I am, right? And it seems to me that we think a lot about bridging and about media, for that matter, as something that helps people think, believe, understand, become educated in a certain way that we want them to, and less as a tool to help understand and know someone or know something, regardless of what that does or does not inspire people to do. And so I'm curious, what does bridging mean to you, and what did you learn about bridge building through the course of this film?
I mean, you said it all so eloquently. So what can I add? There is a kind of in-betweenness that we all encounter in our lives. How do we live in between? And I think right now, it often feels like a place that doesn't have a center of gravity, that we're being pulled to say we have to identify as one thing or another. And I think bridge building is about creating space for in-betweenness. This was a very hard film for me. It's a film that, like everything in Christianity right now, seems to founder on questions of sexuality, even though there are many other questions that are of equal importance or maybe even greater importance that affect lives. But sexuality seems to be this place where within Christianity, things founder, the Methodist Church, split just recently. And I think there's a question. It seems there's a binary. They stand on a line. They choose one, yes, or they choose no. Would I officiate a same-sex wedding? What does it mean to hold that difference between them? Is that possible? Is that wise? Is that fair? What does it mean to express belonging across that divide? And what is the emotional bridge that's required, and what is a bridge too far? I think those are the questions that this film asks, and what I think has been beautiful is that the answers continually surprised me and continue to surprise me. There's something that happens when you hold that space without expectation of it disappearing. It creates the space for possibility that you couldn't see before. And it's certainly possibility that I couldn't see before at the beginning of the film. And it's certainly possibility that even at the end of the film, the pastors couldn't see. Now, a year later, I'm going back to Grand Rapids next week, and there are changes and evolutions and relationships that I could not have foreseen, and that if you had asked me to promise you 2-3 years ago when we began this process, I would have said absolutely not. But that's the beauty of holding space over time. And I think that's what bridge building is about. If we know the answer, if it's that you have to come to me or I have to come to you, then we're not creating space for something that's truly new.
The next words I want to dive into are divided world. What statement do you hope this film makes at this moment in time?
We may be more divided than ever. That's, I think, sort of a common cliche or statement. But we're less neatly divided than we realize. I think if we look at those 12 pastors, I think none of us would get right how they divide on all of the questions that they were asked. And the lack of neatness is a source of opportunity, because it means that there are gradations that allow us to look for also umbrellas. And I think we are very divided, but I think there is a yearning that I feel every time I talk to people about this film, and every time I talk to people about Won't You Be My Neighbor, for how can we do it differently? There's got to be something different because this feels awful. And I think that is a very, very powerful force and one we shouldn't underestimate.
Let's dive into the word media next. One of the reasons that PACE supported this film is because we think that there are a lot of dominant narratives and dominant portrayals in media and culture that at best misunderstand or misrepresent faith, and at worst actually manipulate and weaponize it. What do you think media and culture get wrong in how they talk about and showcase faith, what it means to people, what it means to society?
Yeah, I think there is just a huge amount of smugness in both directions around faith. You know, a smug look from people that say, "Oh, I left that behind years ago. You'll get there," you know, or a smug look from people of faith saying, you know, I know where you'll be, you know. I'm not sure that's a really helpful conversation. I think a more interesting conversation is, you have faith in something in your life, I have faith in something in my life. Why is what's important to you, and why is what's important to me important to me? And maybe in sharing those stories with each other, we discover something that is of shared importance that we can build on. I think that's the essence of all the work that everyone does in this room. But I think to showcase it in this kind of very vulnerable way that these pastors do allows us to recover the idea of faith as a source of ballast in difficult times, rather than something that is a source of division or a source of othering. Yeah.
That makes me think of an article I read a couple of years ago. I forget the author. It was in, I believe it was Washington Post magazine, and it was titled something to the effect of how religion can actually save democracy. And one of the quotes in there that I'll never forget, it said, the whole premise of faith is humility. And that's so much of what our democracy needs right now. And the quote said, the whole purpose of faith is to be able to say, I'm right. I know I'm right. I could be wrong. And you who believe different than me, you are wrong. I know you're wrong, but you could be right. Isn't that what faith requires of us? And isn't that in some ways what citizenship requires of us as well?
Absolutely. I mean, faith requires doubt, right? It's not faith if it is a testable certainty, right? It's just not. It's faith requires doubt. Faith requires the possibility of rupture. Faith requires the possibility of discord, right? But we have faith that if we experience that, there may be something on the other side of that too, right? There may be a risk of rupture because we have faith that there is a kind of repair that we can do afterwards. And I think that's where we sort of stand at the water's edge too often. So afraid of rupture at this point that we'd prefer to put ourselves in places where we can never be hurt. And there is something extraordinary, as one of the pastors says in this movie, about experiencing love from someone that you thought could not love you and whom you thought was unlovable. And I think that is a very powerful thing. And I think that is the essence of what we think about when we think about democracy, right? We have faith in a country that we can go through rupture and we can do the repair. And we've lost that faith because we haven't done a lot of it recently. You know, we haven't done the rupture. We've done a lot of rupture, and then we've walked away from it because it's just been too painful. So how do we go through the rupture into repair? And that doesn't mean that everyone can just say what they want, right? These 12 pastors are incredibly careful in how they articulate themselves, and they still hurt each other, right? So it's not about saying, don't be careful. It's about saying, how do we find that vulnerability that we're willing to express in ourselves, find it in each other, and through that build something more beautiful, more perfect.
Going back to the theme of love, we're at a philanthropy conference. Philanthropy means love of humankind. It's also the last word that I want to interrogate with you. Okay, permission to say the hard thing that people in this room might not want to hear. But when we think about philanthropy, what is it about the business model and the flow of resources that risks perpetuating rupture, that risks perpetuating, not creating the space that you're talking about? What is it about our work that makes your work and this type of repair harder?
So you all know your work much better than I do, so I don't want to, I can't really say, oh, well, if only you did this, and I hate it when people say that about movies. Well, if only, the character had,
It's just that simple.
Exactly. I do think that what I learned through this film and what I see just all around us is a retrenchment into things that feel safe. What I hope we can do is find possibility and explore things that don't feel safe together, right? Confident that an amount of love that we share together will allow us to get through that difficulty and to something that's better. When it comes to film, it's like, oh, well, let's finance a film that's already successful, right? Or let's finance a topic where we already know the audience. Or let's cover a topic where we can be absolutely sure we're not offending anyone, or we're only offending the people we want to offend. And I think there is something beautiful about reaching out and grabbing the third rail of something and saying, no, let's dive in, right? Let's not reduce Japanese internment to a paragraph and a half in a history textbook, but explore the complexity and difficulty and contradictions inherent in it. And I think that that's where philanthropy shines, because philanthropists have the opportunity to take risks that the rest of us don't often get a chance to take in our day-to-day lives, because, we have a 3-month-old daughter at home who's wondering where her dad is, and I admire that. And when I see philanthropists take risks and fail, I feel heartened, and I feel like, well, then I can do that too. I can join that. And so rather than, I guess what I would say is I hope that philanthropists can lead in that space, rather than waiting for individuals to lead in that space and to follow close behind them. Because to shine the searchlights that you have out into the wilderness and say, hey, check it out, is just one of the greatest gifts, and there is so much to discover in that sort of liminal space that can feel unsafe.
So like Caitlin and Ayana before us, they only gave us 20 minutes, so I also don't have time for audience questions, but I want you to leave people hanging, and I want people to be able to talk with you at the reception after. I hope you have a receiving line of people waiting to ask you questions, but I want to end with this question. You are a brilliant creator. You are a gift. You also happen to come from a particularly artistic family, and you are on the board of Silk Road. And so what I want to ask you as we conclude our time together and we welcome Silk Road back, I want to ask you about some of the themes that we've been talking about today: art, media, film, science, power, dignity, hope, faith, music. How would you tie that all together for us. What themes or foundations should we take away from our time together today that also are a reflection of the work that you're trying to do?
Look at what endures. If you go back thousands of years, there are no countries that endure, currencies, certainly no companies that endure. Art endures. Music endures. Faith endures. Science endures. And all of those things require philanthropy in the present because no one else can work on that kind of a time horizon to say, what are we leaving behind, not in 5 years, not in 50 years, but in 500 years and in 1,000 years. And we cannot know, and that is the gift of faith, we cannot know that the work we do today will be that work. But we can know that we're surrounded by an army of people who are trying, and that some of that work will endure and will inspire someone to look back 2,000 years later and say, hey, maybe I can do something different with my life. The work that these three musicians brought to us earlier, Lullaby by Nassim Khorasani, More Perfect by Kaoru Watanabe, are examples of people creating art and playing with art and playing across instruments and across cultures to create something new that they hope will endure. And it's to do that fearlessly, knowing that we will get hurt and may not succeed, right? To do that intergenerational work that creates some possibility that someone out here will hear something and think something different. Brian Eno talked about art as a way of synchronizing our emotions, right? Synchronizing our feelings, right? I think that is what endures, those things that synchronize us, and I think faith is like that too. And so I'm grateful to be with you all today, and I'm grateful that you do the work that you do because you create what does endure. And because I forgot the names of the last two pieces, I'm going to look them up on my phone. We're going to close with Mardigi Yerke, which is arranged by our wonderful cellist, Karen Uzunian, and Farika, which was composed by Maeve Gilchrist, our beautiful harpist. So I'm so grateful to be here and share this film with you. leapoffaithfilm.com if you want updates on it, and happy to talk about it. I hope that there are many more films and many more pieces and musicians like this that come out of the work that you do. I'm grateful. Thank you.